Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Ben Okapari, and since 2010, I have interviewed hundreds upon hundreds of songwriters about the writing process. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a writer myself. So I've always been interested in treating songwriters the same way that we treat poets and traditional prose writers, as writers, plain and simple. There is no talk of how bands get their name, favorite tour stories, favorite foods, band drama, or anything else. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers as we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process. That's it, nothing else. And with that, let's get into today's episode. And today on the podcast, it's James McGovern from the Murder Capital. The Murder Capital's new album, Blindness, is out now. Apparently, I am working my way through the Dublin scene. In the past year, I've had on separately Grian and Digo from Fontaines, DC. In the past month, I had on together Josh and Eli from Inhaler. So all these Dublin bands must be a hot place. I was struck by the reason why I reached out to interview James was I'm a fan of the Murder Capital anyway, but he had name checked the poet Margaret Atwood in their press release, and I thought, wow, so few songwriters talk about poets and the influence they have on them, so we have to talk. And we spent a good deal, probably the first 10 minutes of this, talking about, you name it, Yeats, Margaret Atwood, that strong influence the literature has on him. And he says he's a slow reader, not because he's just a slow reader in general. He can't read faster. He certainly can, but he really likes to savor the words. So we had a really good discussion about literature and that influence that it has on his writing. And also movies do as well. I've heard that a lot from songwriters. But there's one thing he said towards the end that struck me. And I wish I were like this, but we were talking about the ritual, and he says, I quote him, and he says this emphatically, I have categorically no rituals when it comes to writing because I don't want to think something can go wrong if things aren't set up the right way. I wish I were like that. My fault, I think, as a writer is that I have a ritual, and my fear with rituals is that I think, well, I'm not in the right place. It's not the right time. I can't write now. And the advantage of having no rituals is that you're free from that. You can write anywhere at any time rather than thinking, okay, I've got to have these things with me. So because of that, he can really write and perform any place, any time, and he also says he has no rituals when it comes to pre-show routines, but it's kind of the same thing. And that really struck me. We talked also about writer's block and the importance of writing the bad stuff, writing the bad shit before you get to the good ones. That is so important as a writer. So anyway, I really enjoyed this conversation. This was not really about rituals as much as it was one of those conversations about the drive to write and why we write. So anyway, the Murder Capital's latest album, Blindness, is out now. And here is my interview with James McGovern of the Murder Capital. I usually end the interviews discussing literature, but I was intrigued by your reference to Margaret Atwood, and you listen to a poetry podcast. And listen, I can count on one hand the number of songwriters who read poetry. I mean, I think songwriters are voracious readers. I mean, I that's not an issue, and I think there's a very clear through line between reading and being a good writer. But very few actually read poetry. So let's start with that at least. I mean, who are some of your favorite writers? Who do you like to read? Does that influence you as a writer? All that good kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think growing up as a kid, I had a sort of a surrogate mother as well as my own mother, but my surrogate mother, she introduced me to poetry from a young age. Um, Specifically, I remember Philip Larkin's poetry, um, the famous poem about your parents fucking you up, and her reading that to me when I was maybe like 7 or 8 and finding the sort of hilarity within it. You know, it sort of took away the idea that I don't know if I had a preconceived notion of poetry at 7 or 8, but if I did anyway, it made it feel fun and feel light. Um, and from there, I think my dad was always kind of uh, quoting Kipling's "If" to me, like in many different situations where I was maybe, uh, yeah, treading in maybe unfavorable waters, let's say, as a kid or whatever. So there was a sort of a natural, I think, maybe just natural to the kind of Irish culture anyway, a natural amount of poetry and storytelling flying around the rooms as a kid, and yeah, that really came with me once I started writing songs. Started writing songs when I was about 14, I guess. Mm.
So do you still is that still your preferred genre? Do you like to read a lot of fiction and nonfiction? What do you like to read now?
It really varies, I read at the moment. I'm actually reading the Marlon Brando's biography. I can't remember who wrote this edition, but it's the one.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I'm really enjoying that, and I'm always kind of carrying around some poetry. Paul Elwar is one that made a big impression on me. His love poems, specifically on writing our second record. I had quite an intense time reading them. Intensive time, I should say. Actually, it wasn't so intense. It was actually quite beautiful. And mm, yeah, I mean, it's been. I'm trying to think what else I've been reading, man. Uh, Always reading W.B. Yeats poetry. Always. That's kind of like going to the toilet or something. You know what I mean? I just have some of that on hand at all times. It's a kind of an obvious one to pick, but Lake Isle of Innisfree was a really sort of shifting kind of moment for me when I read that. Probably in my late teens or something like that. But yeah, I don't really have I don't have I'm not a sort of a preferred genre kind of person.
I'm the same way. I mean, I feel like when I read a book, my first reaction isn't, "Oh, let me read other things by that author." It's, "Let me get another voice in my head." So I don't think I've ever thought, "Oh, I need to read something else by that person." It's, "I need to read another voice to experience all those things."
Mm. Yeah, totally, totally. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Um, I remember reading. I remember that during the pandemic, I got a copy of Tom Robbins's "Still Life with Woodpecker." I remember being totally bowled over by that book. I think I read it like I'm actually normally not a very fast reader. Not that I can't, but I don't enjoy it. I like to really mull it over, and I'm more than happy to reread a chapter if I've found something in it. So I kind of take my time with books, and but with that one, I remember kind of just going through it in like a day, um, and just being so affected by just the sort of extravagance of the story, but also uh, the beauty of the characters. I can't remember now, but again, yeah, I'm not actually. I'm kind of like the type of. It's the same with films and with poetry as well as novels. I kind of am engulfed within that story for the time that I'm interacting with it, and then actually recalling uh, specificities within it. I find it difficult, but I always see it come out in my own work. You
Oh,
know,
you do? I was gonna ask you that. So you see whether it's intentional or not, you see there's a link between the things that you're reading and the songwriting that you're doing?
totally, totally, totally. I mean, arguably, maybe even more so through the cinema that I'm watching. I find myself more directly affected. Although I suppose um, through reading and through reading poetry, I find my vernacular is broadening. More than anything, that's what I find happens when from those places. But the sort of like inspiration and the feeling of um, I find it's unmatched for me, the feeling of coming out of a great film at the cinema, and that feeling that you're sort of embodying this, coagulated version of you and the film, and what you feel is possible in the world, or what I feel is possible in the world, seems completely broadened, sometimes for weeks. I mean, more often than not for a couple of hours, but I like to really hold on to that. It's kind of why I like to go to the cinema alone, because there's nothing worse than, I think, being like deeply affected by a piece of work, and you come out, and your mate's like, I thought that was shit.
Right.
And the bubbles like burst immediately.
So
Uh,
I had an interview yesterday with a songwriter, and we were discussing it. It took me, I was always the kind of reader that I would always finish a book no matter how much I didn't like it. I felt like I had to finish it. But once I finally said, fuck it, I'm not going to finish this. I don't want to finish it. It was incredibly liberating. And now that I do that, it's so freeing because I always used to say, I've got to finish this. And once I said, fuck it, no, I'm not going to finish this. I don't want to. It's a waste of my time. There's other things I could be doing. It opened up a whole new world. So are you like that, or do you feel like you have to finish it?
it's an extremely validating moment between us, man. Yeah, because I often don't finish books. Like, I'm probably I was having a laugh with my therapist recently, because I was kind of, I was just sort of started to speculate that I'm not really personally too interested in getting a diagnosis or medicated, just because, just from I don't know, I just don't feel like it, basically, and it works for some people. But I was speculating that I was like, do I? And we've been working together for like 12 years. I was like, do you think maybe I have like ADHD? And he burst out laughing, and he was like, it's absolutely undeniable that you do. So I was wondering why there's so many unfinished books and half-written songs and all this stuff, but it's just the way I work. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. And even
Uh,
if sometimes it's from the point that you're coming from, where it's I'm just not enjoying it, or it's just not it's not feeding where you're at. I think that's the kind of beauty of the interaction with art that we're all having all the time, is that, yeah, you can just put it down and move on. And it can become a curse, because, yeah, because the world is kind of built on distraction, in many ways now. But at the same time, there's such a personal feeling, I think, about what you're choosing to. It's why it's such a bane to choose a film. Because I feel like we're not choosing films anymore. We're choosing like the extraction of feelings that we want to have, that we want to bring up. Do we want to go to this place, to that place? Do we want to go nowhere? Do we want to be numbed? We've become these like the ultimate curators, I think.
It's funny you say that because this seems to be a common theme with songwriters I've interviewed. And, when I had Eli and Josh from Inhaler on, and we were talking about the distractions and how they were saying phones are the worst thing for them and they're really deliberately trying to not do that because they realize how it's a distraction. It's keeping them away from creating, but practically you're not aware of your environment.
Mm.
And I don't want to sound like an old man because that's not it at all. But you realize as an artist, if you're not exposed to the things around you, so I'm hearing that interestingly, like in the past year, there seems to be a movement to get away from that. So I'd love to your take on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't think it's funny. I think every generation has its sort of moments, and I think, you know, I grew up in a time, just like, I kind of just remember, I think the first iPhone came out when I was maybe 11 or something like that. But I remember the time before it. And so I don't think, like, when you said, like, you don't want to sound like an old man, like, I kind of, I get that. And I feel like that sort of, you don't want to be that jaded voice in the room who's stating the obvious, or phones are distracting or whatever. But I think I think it's fair to say that it will be the sort of one of the greatest sociological, philosophical sort of questions that we have to ask of ourselves, of this time period. It's undoubtable, um, and that's because all we have is our time. You know, I have to personally have to uh switch my SIM card out and get a Nokia when I really want to focus in, you know, especially in the kind of like lead up to a record, to a recording, to recording a record. I have to do that because um I want to I want my world to be as kind of untouchable as possible. And I don't mean that in a sort of a trite, sort of egotistical way. I just mean it more in a sense of like I just want to be able to exist within the world that I'm writing in, and I don't want to have to hear the noise of the world. You know, it's a difficult one. I mean, it really, even discussing that, it brings me on to that. I was actually in a taxi last night, and I got into the cab, and the fella was like, "How are you?" And he just had a very slightly dejected tone when he asked me. So I said, I'm fine. How are you? And he was like, "Oh, I'm okay." So a couple of minutes later, I asked him again. I was like, "How are you really?" And um, we had this like incredibly sort of um sobering. Not that I'm unaware, but it was sobering to hear from his point of view. He's a Romanian man, and he's been living in London for about 20, 22, 23 years, and um, he was just talking about the sort of precipice of, I know we're going off songwriting here, I'm sorry, but
No
he was
worries.
talking about the precipice of World War III looming larger than ever, in his opinion, and obviously reflecting many opinions globally at the moment. And um, it was just very, yeah. And I asked him that question. I was like, on a philosophical level and on a personal level, do you feel, he was basically, he was sort of saying that he can't really live his life right now. He feels so wound up by what's going on in these political spheres and social spheres. And I asked him the question. I was like, "Do you think we have a responsibility to actually interact with it, and do we need to listen to the news?" From what I'm aware, like I've actually never myself been um, in any sort of psychiatric care, but I've had some friends and family who have, and one of the first things they do when they bring you in there is uh, they sort of get you off listening to the news all the time.
Hmm.
Um, and that was kind of interesting. He thinks the taxi driver's response was that he does think we have responsibility to interact with those things, and he thinks that anyone who basically cares or whose life has been built around them in a way that gives them the opportunity to care, I suppose. He didn't say it in such a nice way, but uh, he sort of said everyone else is an idiot and they don't listen to the news and they just live their lives, and so which is fair enough too, I guess. But it does beg the question, um, the phone is there. The phone contains all this information. I'm trying to find my way back. It contains all this information. Are we responsible to interact with it? At what point are we forced to interact with it? So I feel Eli and Josh's pain there. I think we all do, you know.
So let me turn that into then your a question about your process. So when things happen and you feel the urge to write, I mean, the urge, not, oh, I want to write. You feel like you have to write. Um, do you need distance to be able to write about something, or is it better to write in the immediacy of the moment?
Yeah, proximity is it's kind of it's a real unknown, I think, for me. I find that proximity to what I think I'm writing about. This is a thing as well as I try. It's fairly rare that I know exactly what I'm writing about and that I'm sitting down to write about something. My process is very much, or at least my thought process on writing is that if I'm not there, it won't be written. It's kind of as simple as that. So I try as much as possible to sit here at this desk I have in my sitting room, and or if I'm on the move, I have this sort of journal with me that I'm showing you. Obviously, it's useless for a podcast, but I'm presenting Ben here with a messy notebook thing that I have, and like that's my kind of thought on it. It's proximity to the page is more important than proximity to the subject.
So you're
It's
okay with distance, or I guess, some people say it's too raw, it's too fresh. I've got to take a step back. I've got to, like Hemingway famously said, he could never write about Paris when he was in Paris. He always had to have that distance. Um, but some people feel like the further they are from that, the less raw it is.
that's proven true for me in that this album Blindness that we've just released is the first time that I've really directly and um, uh, with intention written about Ireland with a song like Love of Country. It has such a direct, well, there's a few messages in there, but they're quite there, more so than abstractions I would have uh, been prone to using throughout some of the lyrical work in the past. Um, but that's very direct. And again, I didn't sit down to write about that. And although the Dublin riots had just happened, and there's elements of the pandemic in that story as well, um, it's really questioning a sort of distortion of patriotism and a conflation of patriotism and nationalism, which I think is where the danger seems to bubble up from. Um, yeah, I didn't sit down to write that, I just sat down. And that kind of brings me back to that point. It's kind of proximity to the page, or not just the page. Like I said as well, like I sit down to this desk. I mean, a lot of the stuff I do write, and what the phone is good for is just into the notes app, the thoughts there. You're on a tube, you're in a club, you're in the jacks at I don't know, whatever. That's where a lot of there's thousands of them, just little seeds,
So I always
little
ask this
seeds.
question because songwriters tell me you have tens of thousands of voice memos or memos on the phone. Is there any sense of organization to those notes whatsoever?
I've just recently, I've just recently actually started a little, what's the word, like folder, in it, and it's ideas. So there's my notes, which include, uh, probably include things like trying to get a hidden message across a table to my girlfriend about wanting to leave somewhere, as much as it includes, you know, maybe the next tune we're going to write, or an idea for a music video, or like someone. I think a lot of my notes is also just like dreams that are way too big is kind of the thing. Like people I'd like to have, on record with us, or uh someone I'd like to star in one of our music videos. It's usually just outlandish ideas, but I try and do that and then let our manager sort of make some sort of semblance of reality.
So I mean, I'm looking right now. I have all these notes app. I have all these notes. I never go back to them. I mean, do you really go back? I
Right.
guess those song ideas, when do you go back to them? Do you go back to them when you're thinking, I need a melody, I need a line? Like, how often do you really go back to those?
Yeah, I go back a lot,
You
honestly. I
do?
go back a lot. That's kind of like what I do on the toilet is I go through my notes app, and I just um I'm either sort of emaciated by my own mediocrity is kind of mainly what I do. And then every now and again something pokes through,
This is crazy. The interview I had yesterday was songwriter named Gordy.
Mm.
She is based in Australia. And listen, I've done 400 of these interviews, and you and her both said the same thing: is that you go to the toilet to get ideas. I've heard that twice in the past 24 hours.
Well, I
I
go to the
mean,
toilet. Let's get it straight though. I go to the toilet to go to the toilet, man. You know what I mean? The idea is it's certainly not like here we go. I'm gonna go in there and sort of, yeah, but when I'm trying to stave off doom scrolling, I'll be in the notes app just having a peek, and so yeah, I definitely go back, and like going back, like that's it's kind of interesting to what you last said about proximity to the subject matter, but also proximity to having written it. is sometimes the most kind of important part, you know, because there's often the rush um, of writing, you know, which is great, and we all kind of want to exist on that wave, you know. I go down to this place called Cafe Kick on Exmouth Market in London that I really love, and I write there, and you know, I'm often, you know, today happens to be a very beautiful day, but I'm more often than not in London, walking there under the grey clouds, and um, but I have a lift because I'm going to go and write, you know, and I don't know what's going to come, and I'm sort of existing on the hope of a good day, you know. Um, and then some days you're riding that wave, and it's all coming, and others, and mostly, like I said, you're kind of, and I heard Nick Cave say this once, but you're sort of faced by your own mediocrity, and that really stuck with me just because it's refreshing in some ways to hear artists talk about, you know, that mostly what they make is shit, you know, and it's oftentimes even worse than that. It's repulsive, you know. It's like you know, you can barely look at yourself because the work is so um meaningless, you know. And I think that's the kind of that's the structure I'm trying to build within my work, at least within my the scaffolding within my head of how I work. Is That's another great poem. Um, Scaffolding. Who
Yeah.
wrote that? Seamus Heaney. What am I saying? Seamus Heaney. Yeah.
I'm ashamed we didn't let's edit
Terrible.
that part out.
Yeah,
That's
we'll edit that apart
we've
out.
lost all credibility. Anyone listening has we have no credibility if we didn't. My God, how embarrassing.
Listen, I
Um
made my disclaimer at the beginning that my recall is shocking, but you know, it's probably some sort of like disease, and will live. You know.
so
Um.
I have
Yeah.
this is I interviewed the writer Anthony Doerr about 10 years ago. He wrote a book that won the Pulitzer Prize called All the Light We Cannot See about 12 years ago. And I asked him about writer's block, and he said writer's block is a myth. He said he called it a failure of courage. And I love that. And that's, I think, what we're talking about is that you can't be afraid to write the bad stuff. And we can all write it, but if you think that you're too important and all you can only put down the great stuff, that's where the writer's block. But I love that idea of a failure of courage, that we can all write and you can't be afraid to write the shit first. And if you're, and I love that idea, but he thinks writer's block is a myth. He's like, we all have it, but it's because you're afraid to put the bad stuff down. That's the issue. And I think I heard a little bit of that's what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, I resonate with that on some level, you know, not to say, you know, I think writer's block is it's probably like it's like a sort of a misconceived emotion or something, you know. It's more of a probably like a blockage of actually emotion inside you. I think to even perceive your writing as great in the first place when you're the writer of it is kind of farcical. And I think it's also missing the point of writing, I think, which is, you know, for me, if I've written something that really strikes a chord with me, it's on a much deeper level than I can intellectualize or verbalize, you know, and um, that's the job. I think, you know, it's to not only to evoke emotion, but also to create the atmosphere in which we can live, and these emotions can arise naturally, you know. There's nothing there's nothing innately clever about a great lyric or about a great poem. I don't think, you know, I think there's something far beyond anything like that, you know.
And you also said something, and I agree with you 100%. I mean, I feel like when I start to write, I don't have any right knowing what I'm going to write about. I think the problem comes with, at least for me, is thinking I've got it all figured out. I write to discover, um, and for me at least, once I really grabbed a hold of that idea, that just start to write, because I don't have any right knowing. Like I've got a writing, and writing is discovery. that makes it a
Yeah.
lot easier if you take that approach rather than this is what I'm going to write about and here's how I'm going to get there. I don't know. That's how I feel about it. That makes it a lot easier for me.
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, I really do resonate with that as well. It's I've written a couple of tunes where I did know what I had to write about, and it was extremely difficult. It was just a much more arduous process for me. Um, you know, as well, it was kind of at a time where I was writing about my friend who passed away, and trying to honor that life. It's just a totally different ball game, really. I've never tried to write a novel or anything like that, but I don't really envy the author. I think for me, when I'm writing songs or poetry, I just feel a little bit like I'm being led down this garden path, and the editing process is a totally different thing. Then, it's I feel like writing is dog and editing is cat. In some sort of way.
So I've got to I want to ask you about editing quickly, but I have a great quote up here. Got all these quotes by writers. E.L. Doctorow, the novelist. This is the one quote songwriters love. Listen to this quote. Writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way.
Hmm.
Writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. And that's, I think, what we're talking about is,
Hmm.
you can see a little bit in front of you, but you can make the
Hmm.
whole trip if you just think about it in short increments.
Exactly, exactly. And you can sort of even expand on that. And every now and again, it's like, you know, I mean, it's a sort of a cliche imagery to bring into it, but in that fog, every now and again, lightning does strike, and all of a sudden the entire scene shows up in front of you, but it contracts immediately. And I think those are the moments that I live for when I'm writing, is that feeling of like, oh my God, I see it all, and you're just sort of trying to just get out whatever. Um, you're just trying to hold on to that impetus that you have in those moments, because it literally, someone opens the door of your apartment, your girlfriend comes home, or like you say, the phone rings, you know what I mean? And bang, the whole scene shutters down again. Um, it's killer. Yeah, it's killer how um fragile the whole process is, but at the same time, it's so brutal.
So when those things happen all at once and the songs happen immediately and you're having that lightning moment, are you less likely to revise those songs that
Yeah,
happen quickly?
yeah, big time. I try as hard as I can to respect them, because what happens is that happened with a tune on the new record called Love a Country, where I just sat down and wrote, like I spoke about it a bit earlier, but I just wrote that whole thing. We were in the rehearsal space in Dublin, in Temple Lane Studios, and Irv was playing the guitar, and I was we were just waiting for the other lads to arrive, and I was sitting there writing, and this sort of, yeah, whatever you want to call it, I don't know. Sometimes people really focus in on, like, so do you start with poetry or lyrics, and I'm like, sometimes I can't. I don't know what's the total difference there. My process, it doesn't feel that different, but I was writing, and this whole thing came out, and to be totally honest, those moments are few and far between for me. Uh, I can remember them all. So with that one, it was just, and as the months go on, then you're building up to recording a record. You're getting into the sort of the hypercritical zone, where you're trying to just actually, and this is something we work with a lot with John Congleton, is kind of remaining kind to the music, not treating it like this sort of thing that's to be bullied, or these are, you know these are songs. They're not, you got to look after them in some way. And although some of them are, you know sort of more harsh, or more uh devilish in their nature, it's still, you can still really beat the shit out of a song before it becomes what it could. And that kind of happened with Love a Country a bit, where I started to think like, oh, off this line here, this line there, I'm not really sure about that. And because it would just be, it's the dilution of a moment, I suppose. And it's like with any songwriting itself, it's like the the preciousness of knowing when to stop writing, is kind of the biggest part. I think um you can filter quality, you can understand what quality means to you. Um, you have that through your reference points, through the songs you grew up listening to, the songs that you admire. Um, but knowing when to stop is a whole other sort of skill, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I used to ask that question, how do you know when a song is done? And I don't think we ever came up with a satisfactory answer. I mean, I think as a prose writer, for me, it's at least, how do I know when I need to stop editing? And the best I like when Mark and I were writing this book together, I guess the best my thought was, if I make this change, is anyone going to know the difference? Like if is anyone going to care if this has changed? If they don't care, then probably it's probably fine the way it is.
Yeah, well, that's the whole sort of process we were brought in on making our second record was kind of like how unexistential most things are in the studio and how it's just doesn't matter that much. What matters really matters, but should we finish, should the outro have drums or no drums, or should it doesn't really matter. You want it to feel right to some extent, but like you say, this is the thing. It's how whatever we present our work to be, and when you publish your prose or uh, if I release music or publish some poetry or whatever, everyone's going to read that thinking that that's what you meant to say. You know,
Right.
they're not going to think, oh, I wonder if he was going to go for version 2 there with that one or version 16. You know what I mean? They just
Yeah.
take it for what it is. And that certainly goes, even more so, I think, with music, because there's so much, especially in a band, there's so much room for uh, quote unquote error, which I don't, really believe in, but things maybe sounding uh, disjointed, let's say, or some people would say wrong. But if you print that to records, people are going to sit at home, put their headphones on, and think that that's what you meant to do. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Well,
Yeah,
when I write things and I send it to an editor and they send it back to me, I never remember what was in there to begin with. Like, and that's the
yeah,
thing, is I never go, oh, I wish they had kept that word in there. I don't remember what that word was. And so then I
yeah.
realized, you know what? It didn't matter in the first place. Editing. I mentioned editing. We talked about editing. At least for my editing as a prose writer, the first thing I do is I look for prepositions, the ofs, the ats, the ins, the tos, because they drag those sentences down. And I know that's a little different as a songwriter, but I look for that specifically. Like that's the first thing I look for. So I'm curious, when you go to edit and revise lyrics, are there certain specifics that you're looking for to tweak in those passes?
It's really song by song. I find I don't view my work with a sort of traditionally sort of um intellectual eye, let's say. I'm not looking at structure or I'm not like counting out what different rhythms I've used. I try not to get too intertwined with that because again, it loses that kind of purity for me, kind of unknown magic thing that goes on when you're writing. So it really is song by song. Can you get more specific? I might be able to find an example in my mind.
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, like I said, for me at least, it's when I'm done, there are certain things that I do in my writing.
Yeah,
Um, okay. So another example is, I know this is very specific to prose, but if I'm writing if I write a 10 sentence paragraph, I have a
yeah,
tendency to have every sentence clause and clause, clause and clause, clause but clause, clause so clause, like those. And I
yeah,
know that I do that. I don't care that I do it as I write, because I think that's the worst thing to do, is to think about these things as you write.
Yeah.
But then I have to go back and I look for that like that is the checklist of look for that as I write.
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
know that's different from songwriting because you don't have the lines have to be so compact. But I guess what I'm saying is there are certain ticks in my writing that I just have
Mm.
accepted that I go, okay, I'm not as I'm going to write it, but then I have to go back and look for those things.
Yes, I see now. Yeah. I think one thing maybe I've been focusing on in the past couple of years is trying to make sure that I'm saying more about less. Um, that sort of has changed the way that I look at my writing. I have a propensity to be able to sort of flail into uh in different winds, I suppose, different winds that catch me along different verses, and I just kind of like to go with them. And I think in the past, some of my writing has suffered because of that. You know, I think it could have maybe connected even more deeply into what it was really just trying to say. You know, I think when I think about something like, I don't know, I was thinking the other day about Bob Dylan's "Not Dark Yet," you know, and how laser pointed every line in that song is. Um, and yeah, I mean, that was kind of one of those tunes that was always there. My dad's favorite Dylan album, so I was really brought up on that and fed it. But yeah, saying more about less is kind of is definitely something that's on my mind when I'm editing. You know, why is this here? And um, not only why is it here, but am I indulging myself? You know, I'm not sort of indulging myself on a level that I'm, wow, look at how great this work is. It's more that like I'm indulging this sort of um ever shifting way of looking at what a song could mean. You know.
Yeah. All right.
Mm.
Last question. So the ritual. I absolutely have rituals. For example, if I write in this chair, I will always revise in the chair behind me. I never
Right.
revise and write in the same place. There are certain times of day I'm more effective, certain things I have to have with me, certain rooms.
Yeah.
I'd love to explain. I know you mentioned you'd like to go elsewhere to write, but are there certain times of day? Are there certain places where you feel like this is where the mojo is?
I absolutely have categorically no rituals when it comes to my writing or my performing because I do not want to feel like something could go wrong because something wasn't set up in the right way for me. Um, I think people are always disappointed with that because I get asked a lot, like, "Oh, what do you do before a show?" You know, and they really want you to say that, like, you have 2.5 shots of Jack Daniels, and then you go over to the mirror and you do the hokey pokey, and you know what I mean? Like, but I just want to be able to write. I want to be able to work. Like, I think my real focus about writing is it kind of comes from as well that our first album was called When I Have Fears. It was named after the John Keats poem, "When I have fears that I may cease to be." But the second line of that is that's the opening line. The second line of that is, "Before my pen has cleaned my teeming brain." You know,
Yes.
so I live in a state of mind where I'm kind of afraid to not get to the next piece of work. I believe that as writers we have a sort of a you know this is going to sound like I'm into astrology now, but I'm actually not. But no offense to my Aquarius queens out there, or whatever you call them. But I do believe that we have this sort of fate that we're getting to, and the less time I sit down to write a song or whatever, I'm just not getting to that next tune that's already there waiting. And so cheers to John Keats for that one.
And that's my fear is that I've restricted myself. And so my excuse is if I'm on an airplane or something like that, then my excuse can easily be I'm not in that place I'd like to be, so I can't write here. And that's the danger. That's why what you do makes it much more flexible. But people like me that feel like, nope, I'm not in that chair. I'll wait till I get there. And that's the
Yeah.
problem.
But I'm easy about it as well, though, Ben. It's like, you know, if I'm on a plane, which I don't particularly like writing on planes either, to some extent, or at least that's how, yeah, my experience. But I don't, that's fine. You know what I mean? It's okay. I think it's just the kind of like, I don't want to make it feel like, yeah, if I'm not at my desk, how could I possibly write or something like that? I think it's fine not to want to write. Writing's difficult, and I think at its most difficult, it's extremely painful, and it can be sad, and it's easier to talk about how beautiful it is, and how it enriches our sort of way of life, and how we could do nothing else, and that's all true, on some level, but also, sitting down and really looking at yourself, it's it can be very disparaging.
Yeah.
We're all these kind of, we all just, I think, on every level, we all just kind of want to be accepted at our core, and more than anything, I think we want to be accepted by ourselves. And that's kind of what writing pulls you in and out of, is this kind of understanding of yourself and disgust of yourself and acceptance of yourself and all these different things.
So do you write every day, or are you okay with not writing sometimes?
No, I'm okay with not writing. Sometimes I really see it as periods of collection is kind of how I look at it now. I'm not what I would used to say, what going around my head is, you're useless, you're not a real writer. Look at, I would then romanticize the idea of someone else's life who I admired, that they would obviously be writing all the time and it would be flowing. But I've tried to quieten that that critical voice down, because it's useless. It's actually not doing anything for me. So if a couple of days or even sometimes a couple of weeks passes by and I haven't written anything or committed anything uh, to 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 paper, or to my phone or whatever, I'm okay. I must be just sort of in a different place. I'm sort of, collecting ideas. I'm hearing things. My subconscious is, it's doing its thing, man. A lot of it, a lot of your body and your mind is just, it's doing the work for you.
And the biggest mistake a writer can make, or an amateur writer, is to think that the writing process is only taking place when you're putting pen to paper. You said exactly what I believe, and that is, you have to believe that the writing process is taking place while you're sleeping, while you're eating, while you're walking, while you're talking. And if you're a writer, you have to believe that. And if you don't, I just don't think you'll be successful. But I agree 100% with what you say, that it's happening all the time.
Totally. I mean, to write is to be human, you know, whether you commit something down to a piece of paper, we're all going around this world from the moment we can talk, sharing stories, um, creating narratives. We all certainly live within our own narrative. Uh, and the only difference with, someone who's a writer and someone who's not a writer is that we put it down onto paper. I think we're all artists.
And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, you can find all the episodes on all major streaming platforms, and also at the Songwriters on Process website. That is at songwritersonpodcast.com. Pre-2020, this was not a pod. I was transcribing all of the interviews. So you can find all of them, hundreds of them, many hundreds of them, on the Songwriters on Process website. You'll find both the transcribed interviews and the pod there. Take a deep dive, spend a day. These are great conversations with songwriters just about the writing process. Also, my book, Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, is out now worldwide on Hachette Books. You can find it online in all major bookstores. Mark is a good friend. He is the guitarist in the metal band Lamb of God, and it's his memoir. Again, that is called Desolation, a Heavy Metal Memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari. I am biased, but that's a damn good book. My email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I love suggestions, questions, comments. People always email me and tell me who they want to see on the pod next. You never know. Send me an email, ben@songwritersonprocess.com. That's it for me, everyone. Have a great day.